video was sparked by a comment on one that went up last week, which addressed the question of whether jazz musicians think on a conscious level about chords and scales as they improvise. The commenter describes himself as an amateur trumpet player who's also a professor of philosophy and cognitive science. In part, he writes,
"The idea that we do not have to think about the words we speak is partly due to the fact that we have learned their meaning, as you said in your video. But there is a consensus amongst scientists that the meaning of a word cannot be learned out of the context of its usage. This could lead to the idea that the context of playing while improvising could also determine the learning of how to improvise. I do not think that the concept of context can be reduced to scales or chord progressions, for playing with other musicians can also contribute to the forming of a context. Do you have any thoughts on this matter?"
So without my own expertise in philosophy or cognitive science, my thoughts are going to be based on my interpretation of what he says, which may or may not be on the mark. According to my interpretation, I see two parts to the question. Can the individual components of jazz improvisation be understood or effectively utilized when they're learned or practiced out of context, and is application of information integral to the process of learning it? Regarding the latter, let's turn to a familiar quote that's sometimes attributed to Benjamin Franklin. "Tell me, and I forget. Teach me, and I may remember. Involve me, and I learn." Now, there's a similar statement that's attributed to a 3rd century Confucian philosopher whose name I will not try to pronounce. I'm going to make one slight alteration to the quote to make it more directly applicable to music. Not having heard of it is not as good as having heard of it. Having heard of it is not as good as having heard it. Having heard it is not as good as knowing it, and knowing it is not as good as putting it into practice. Both quotes get to the same point. You can't fully know or understand a thing until you can experience doing it for yourself. And you can't reach that point of fully knowing or understanding without trying to do it, even before you fully understand it. Put more simply, you can't learn to improvise without improvising. When I think back to my days at the Berklee College of Music, which was a long time ago, I don't remember much of anything that my teachers told me. What I remember are the nightly jam sessions with my fellow students as we worked our way from one end of the real book to the other. Now, clearly this was an example of learning by doing, as we would collectively apply what we were individually learning. I would tape those sessions, and truthfully I only taped my own solos, on my little cassette recorder. When I listened to those recordings, trying to hear where I went right and where I went wrong, it was like completing a cycle of study and application. Now, I relate this to my university students by telling them that they're going to learn more from each other by simply playing together than from anything that I can teach them. So if you're a student at any age who is struggling to grasp the complexity of jazz improvisation, give yourself permission to spend time every day just playing, whether that's with real musicians, which is the ideal, or with play-along tracks, which for most people is a reality. With doing comes learning. Now, the converse side of this is that if all you do is just play music without really trying to expand your understanding and ability, your progress will be slower. Effective practicing is hard work, but the payoff is that expanded ability leads to enhanced enjoyment. Most successful musicians are going to spend more time in the practice room than they do on stage. So this brings us to the question of whether the individual components of jazz, like chords and scales, can be effectively utilized if they are learned or practiced outside of the context of playing music. There is a common misconception that an improvised solo consists of memorized licks or patterns that are strung together. Now, this is not altogether incorrect. Everybody has certain phrases that we use as part of our musical vocabulary, just as we do in speaking. The goal of the jazz improviser is never to play a learned phrase in its entirety, any more than we'd be inclined to recite a memorized sentence in the course of a conversation, unless we are specifically quoting someone, which is also a thing in jazz. Still, if you want to write a best-selling book on jazz improvisation, title it something like 500 Licks That Every Jazz Player Must Know. For someone who's trying to learn to improvise, now this would be like trying to learn a language by memorizing words in the dictionary or a string of unrelated sentences. If your knowledge of a word is based on a dictionary definition rather than having heard it used in context, your grasp is narrow, and your ability to use that word in a creative sense is compromised. So if you learn lick number 1 from the aforementioned best-selling book, and then you transpose it to other keys, you've done good work, both in your brain and on your horn. but you really haven't learned anything about how that lick might work in a melodic line. If, however, that lick is something that you initially hear played in a solo that you transcribe, well, your comprehension of how it integrates into the music is greatly expanded. As I've said in other videos, I consider solo transcription to be one of the most crucial aspects of learning to improvise because it is very much about learning the music in context. As you strive to determine what notes the soloist played, every note is heard as part of a melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic framework. If a note is the third or the fifth or the flat nine of a chord, your ear registers that information, even if your brain is not yet aware of it. You also hear things that cannot be notated, like tone quality and time feel. In transcribing solos, you absorb a lot of information that cannot be learned any other way, in my opinion. But it also offers an opportunity for application as you play along with the recording, trying to sound as close to the original as possible. As Clark Terry famously said, you imitate to assimilate. So, apropos of nothing really, I'm reminded of an older trumpet colleague. I don't even remember who it was. He was hired to sub with the Duke Ellington Band during a local appearance, obviously many years ago. At one point, the horns were playing a riff figure that wasn't written down, so he tried to figure out what to play. And one of Duke's regular trumpet players growled at him, saying, "Those are my notes. Find your own." Now, I might be misremembering or butchering the story, but it strikes me as a concise definition of what we're all trying to do, which is to find our own notes.